Hey everybody, it is Tuesday, April 20 something, and welcome back to another live stream with AP World History Modern. This week you've been learning about, well, lately we've been learning about 1450 to 1750. And first we learned about land-based empires and then some major belief systems and changes in belief systems. And now we're learning about maritime connections that were made as people began sailing through new territory and new waters around the world. As a reminder, I'm Mr. Smith, and I'm from MacArthur High School, which is a school in the North Dallas area called Irving, Texas. So before we get into too much today, I want to go over your activity from yesterday. Yesterday, Mr. Logereau gave you a DBQ. That DBQ was a 5-document DBQ with the prompt modeled after the type of prompts that we should get on our DBQ this year. As a matter of fact, it was an abbreviated version or an abridged version of the 2019 DBQ. So what last year's students wrote for their DBQ. And Mr. Logereau challenged you to write an introductory paragraph containing 2 points on our 10-point rubric. The first point that you're meant to achieve is your context point. The second point that you're meant to achieve is your thesis point. So let's read an example of a paragraph here. Now, before we do that, I want to tell you that this is called an exemplar paragraph, which means it's one of the best versions possible. As a matter of fact, this is so good, it was written by a teacher, and not me, but the better teacher of the two of us. So don't feel like you're inadequate if you don't look just like this. Your vocabulary might not be as strong. Your sentences might not vary in sentence structure. But if you have the right ideas and the right concepts, then you're going to be on the right track. And always remember, take the time to check in for feedback with your AP World History teacher. If you send an email with your work in it and ask your AP World History teacher for some feedback, I'm sure that you'll get a better idea of the quality of your work and whether or not it would earn a point. One more reminder, on the AP World History test, there's no degrees. There's no A, B, and C. You either wrote a thesis or you didn't. And so it might be a good thesis, an okay thesis, or an excellent, outstanding thesis. All of those things are worth 1 point on the rubric. So don't get caught up worrying about the quality or worrying about the sentence structure or the vocabulary. Focus on answering the prompt because that's what the College Board is measuring your ability to do. So let's take a second and read this paragraph together. For centuries before the arrival of European merchants, the Indian Ocean had been the center of flourishing trade routes, connecting India to East and Southeast Asia, as well as with East Africa, Egypt, and Arabia. Notice that Mr. Logereau is going about providing context by introducing the reader to the ideas of the Indian Ocean. If the question says, how did the Portuguese change trade in the Indian Ocean? What effect did the Portuguese have? Then understanding the Indian Ocean before the introduction of the Portuguese provides context. However, context also needs to bring the Portuguese from Portugal to the Indian Ocean. So the next sentence helps make that connection. Portugal's naval advances, such as stronger ships, allowed the Portuguese to engage in transoceanic trade and reach the Indian Ocean. Together, these two sentences serve as acceptable context and would earn any student 1 point on the DBQ. That's important because it's important that you understand that these two sentences work together, and that independently, neither of them would be an acceptable example of context. But it takes both of these two sentences, the idea of introducing the Indian Ocean before the Portuguese got there, and then giving examples or evidence about how the Portuguese got there. That's context for Portuguese transforming trade in the Indian Ocean. The next two sentences are Mr. Logereau's thesis statement. They provide all the claims that he's going to go about providing throughout his entire essay. Notice that I highlighted part of this in blue. The part that I put in blue is a direct quote from the actual prompt. That's a really good way to go about writing a thesis. Take the words from the prompt and add the answer. Remember, the best writers, the most eloquent and well-received writers will tell you, from Dr. Seuss to J.K. Rowling, that the most important phases and steps of good writing come in the editing phase. You don't get the chance to edit or proofread or peer review your work. You are turning in a rough draft. And the College Board knows when they grade your DBQ that they're grading a rough draft, that they're grading your very first edition, the very first copy of the work that you've done. So it doesn't have to be perfect and it doesn't have to be beautiful or eloquent. It just has to be well thought out. You're showing the College Board your ability to make claims and support your claims with evidence, and then look at nuance within those claims. That's your skill here, not being a strong writer, but your skill is making and supporting claims. So use the words from the prompt. The Portuguese transformed maritime trade in the Indian Ocean in the 16th century by taxing non-Portuguese ships that traded in the region. That's a major change that took place because of the Portuguese. Notice that it shows us something that the Portuguese actually did. It has to have an action of the Portuguese for it to show how the Portuguese transformed trade. However, the Portuguese never extended their control beyond a few ports and had to compete with Indian merchants and regional states, such as the Ottoman Empire and the Sultanate of Assa. Notice here that this thesis statement is what we would call a complex thesis statement, because it not only addresses change, but it also addresses what stayed the same, or continuity. By addressing two sides of that same coin, this author, Mr. Logereau, has provided us with a complicated thesis statement, which is going to help if it's well developed throughout the essay with earning that 10th point of a complex, well-developed response. So this means that this has 3 claims in it. So it should have 3 body paragraphs. The first body paragraph should have a topic sentence that talks about Portuguese taxing non-Portuguese ships that traded in the region. The second body paragraph should have a topic sentence that explains that despite the first change, Portuguese never extended their control beyond a few ports. And the third body paragraph should show that despite the introduction of the Portuguese, Indian merchants and regional states such as the Ottoman Empire and Sultanate of Assa remained prominent competition. Okay. Don't get rid of this. We're going to spend some time throughout this week continuing to work on the different points of the essay. Right now, you've only got 2 out of 10 points. Hopefully, later in the week, you'll have a lot more points on this DBQ. So keep this, because it's going to continue to be your homework more than one time throughout this week until you have a well-developed essay. Take a minute and read this document. After you've read the document, I want you to think what could provide context for this document. I'll give you about 90 seconds to read. Okay, take about 30 more seconds to think of possible ideas for context for this document. Okay, so here are some ideas I had that might provide context for this document. One idea that I had is what we learned about yesterday with Mr. Logero. New maritime technologies promoted long distance travel. And that long distance travel eventually led to the connection of the two hemispheres, the Eastern and the Western. And that connection is great context for the diseases that are being described here because they were brought over by Europeans to Americans. Another great idea about context here is the long history of isolation of the Americas. Before Columbus's voyage in 1492, the Americas were completely isolated from the European states, and as well as all of Afro-Eurasia, really, which helped keep them isolated from many of the diseases that took place that existed for centuries in Afro-Eurasia. This leads us into our discussion for today. Maybe you remember from last week when we discussed trade routes like the Indian Ocean Trade Network and the Silk Road and Trans-Saharan Trade Network, this very important idea about trade. This is going to come up over and over again from 1200 to 1900. So it's important for us to continue to remember that long distance trade moves more than manufactured goods. Along with the goods come people, animals, plants, disease, culture and language, new technologies and ideas, and population and demographic changes as a result of both disease and new biodiversity. And that's true after 1450 as well as in the periods that we discussed before. After 12, so today we're going to talk about the Columbian Exchange, a brand new trade network that was created because of the connection of the two hemispheres. And we're going to look at the many effects of this new trade network and how this new trade network grew and changed the world around the world, really, all of it, just everything. So let's talk about the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange, short definition, is the new trade network as a result of the connection of the two hemispheres. And it was largely between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. However, that doesn't mean that other parts of the world were left out. Crops and goods that came from the Americas moved into the Middle East, and silver that came from South America played a significant role in the economy of the Indian Ocean Trade Network after 1450, changing the economy of China and the Philippines and other parts of the Indian Ocean Trade Network as well. So the Columbian Exchange truly did change the whole world. However, the Columbian Exchange started because of the connection of the two hemispheres. So all of the things that you learned about yesterday with new maritime technologies, the causes that pushed Europeans to look out into the Atlantic Ocean instead of trying to cross through the Mediterranean into Asia and Africa, all of these things helped lead to the Columbian Exchange. Let's talk a little bit about the specifics about what moved around as a result of the Columbian Exchange. One of the most immediate effects of the Columbian Exchange was the massive spread of disease. See, well, that's not true. All of the Americas was completely isolated from all of Afro-Eurasia before the connection of the two hemispheres. And that meant the diseases that Afro-Eurasians had been carrying around from centuries as a result of long distance trade routes and close connections to animals didn't exist in the Western Hemisphere. See, in the Americas, there weren't many long distance trade routes. Trade was more localized because there were no large beasts of burdens before 1450. And as a result of that, there was a lot less connection of different people from different regions of the world. So there were less immunities and antibodies built inside the American people's bodies. So when the Europeans came over and they began to have contact with American people, a respiratory disease called smallpox spread from face-to-face contact. Smallpox wasn't the only disease that had a severe effect on the Native American population. As Europeans began to settle in the Americas, they brought what the College Board refers to as disease vectors. Disease vectors includes animals like rats and mosquitoes. And these rats and mosquitoes carry diseases like measles. And so with the diseases that came from the Europeans like smallpox and measles, the Native American population was nearly completely decimated. You may have learned of the importance of guns and gunpowder and the unique technologies that Europeans brought with them in order to conquer Native American societies. And while those tools were significant and important, nothing was more deadly than the diseases that Europeans brought with them and the diseases that spread amongst the Native American population with no way to fight those diseases. As a matter of fact, in some areas, up to 90% of the population may have been completely wiped out by disease. This disease played a significant role in the Europeans' ability to take over the territory and conquer even major empires like the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire. Another important reality of the Columbian Exchange is the fact that there were crops that existed in the Americas that hadn't been heard of or seen in Afro-Eurasia, and vice versa. Some of the most important examples are American crops like maize and tomatoes, potatoes, and even tobacco. These were some of the most, you can see pictures of some of these and the other crops in the top picture. Remember, the top picture are examples of crops that existed in the Americas that had not been heard of in other places around the world. And as these crops moved around, they played incredibly important roles. Obviously, you know about the importance of tobacco and its economic value as it was such an addictive substance and became something that people began to smoke and chew all around the world, and an extraordinary part of a cash crop economy. Remember, cash crop is when crops are grown to sell rather than grown for sustenance. Other important items that moved into the rest of the world included maize and potatoes. Such items were incredibly important in places where the populations were struggling. They helped revive the population of Europe after decades of decimation, more than a century since the Black Plague. It also helped keep the population growing in places like Africa, despite such atrocities that we'll discuss later, like the Atlantic slave trade, where more than 16 million Africans were kidnapped from Africa and taken to the Americas and sold into slavery. Despite the millions and millions of people who were taken out of Africa, the overall population of Africa remained stable and even grew as a result of many of the new cash crops and American crops that were brought to Africa and grown in Africa. Crops came from Europe and Asia as well, came to the Americas. Some examples of these in particular are fruits like bananas and apples and citrus fruits that grew in America. But crops not only came as a result of the Columbian Exchange. As we mentioned before, millions of Africans were taken out of Africa, and along with them came such goods as okra and rice, changing the development of food and in the Americas. Another important thing that came to the Americas were animals. Europeans brought with them pigs and cows and horses, which radically changed the economy and culture of the Americas. One of the most important cash crops in the Americas, important in terms of the economy of the Americas, was sugarcane. Sugarcane was widely popular around the world, and it grew throughout the tropical areas of the Americas, in the Caribbean and in the northern portions of South America, especially in Brazil. Sugarcane was a wildly popular good. However, it was an extraordinarily dangerous and difficult work environment. The heat and the constant work days and the year-round nature of growing and harvesting sugarcane led to an incredibly difficult situation for labor. At first, Europeans tried to enslave Native Americans, but as a result of the many problems that came from diseases, Europeans who came to settle in the Americas had a difficult time creating efficient slave systems in the Caribbean and South America. Such native slave systems worked in places like Mexico and, well, modern day Mexico, but in Spanish America and along the western coast, where the Aztec and Inca empires had millions of Native Americans, leaving thousands even after the deaths as a result of diseases. Europeans looked elsewhere to meet their desire for free or coerced labor. And this is where they became involved with the African slave trade. Europeans traveled to the African coast where they would engage in trade in order to capture slaves and bring the slaves by the millions from the Americas, from Africa to the Americas, where they were sold into slavery to plantation owners, primarily in the Caribbean and in Brazil, where millions, if not 90% of all the Africans who were brought from the Americas, from Africa to the Americas, about 90% were taken to the Caribbean or to Brazil, where they worked most likely on sugarcane plantations. This brings us to another aspect of the Columbian Exchange. One important part of the Columbian Exchange is known as the transatlantic slave trade, or sometimes referred to as the triangle trade. The transatlantic slave trade was a gruesome reality of the development of the new economies in the Americas. Africans by the millions were taken from Africa and brought to Europe, brought to the Americas in order to participate in the, I don't like that, in order to, forced to work in the economy, in the cash crop based economy. I didn't like that I used the word participate because that sounds voluntary. And obviously this type of labor was not voluntary. It was an extraordinary degree of coerced labor. As Africans came to the Americas, they brought with them their ideas of culture and customs, and what is often called the African diaspora. We've talked about diaspora before when we talked about trade, and we've talked about it in a voluntary sense. But the African diaspora is a much more involuntary idea. In this case, once again, you have people taken from their homeland and forced to live in minority communities in new places where they didn't have power or say over their lives. However, in these minority communities, they held strongly to their local customs and cultures. In the case of the African diaspora, many African customs and cultures mix together to create new ideas, because oftentimes people from local regions or the same tribes or the same kingdoms or the same customs were separated and spread amongst each other. And so they brought with them ideas such as language, food, and music. So let's talk a little bit and debrief about the Columbian Exchange. Take about 30 seconds to look at this picture. So what's the context for this picture? Well, the Columbian Exchange. The idea that horses, the idea that horses didn't exist in the Americas prior to the introduction of Europeans into the American society. And the idea that corn didn't exist in Europe before the connection of the two hemispheres, and maize and tomatoes and potatoes and other crops were brought from the Americas to Europe. This is the whole concept of the Columbian Exchange. Okay, so here's the deal. Even though we spent our day talking about the Columbian Exchange today, I want you to continue working on your DBQ so that soon we'll have an opportunity to look at all the points and all the skills of the DBQ. So hopefully you've already downloaded the file 4.1, 4.2 homework and practiced with the documents and the prompt, because we looked at that already today. If you haven't, please remember that you can find that in the description. For this video, there's a link in the description just below the video. So I want you to take the claims that we made earlier today. Remember, we looked at the thesis, and the thesis had 3 claims in it. I want you to take those claims, and I want you to see what documents could serve to prove those points, and work to develop your paragraphs. They won't be very long paragraphs because you only have 5 documents, and if you're going to spread them out into different claims, that's okay. And you don't have to have multiple documents in every single paragraph. But how can you use your 5 documents to support those 3 claims that we made in our thesis earlier today? Take the time to write out the paragraphs. We're going to add more to those paragraphs later, but it's okay because right now we're just looking and learning. So take some time. Even though it's not about the Columbian Exchange, it is about maritime empires and the development of maritime economies. So I want you to go and begin to build these 3 paragraphs. All right, everybody. Hopefully you had an opportunity to review some important concepts. I strongly encourage you to look up the Columbian Exchange in your textbook or find more information. One of the truly most helpful sources when learning about the Columbian Exchange is the Columbian Exchange Wikipedia page. Take some time to go there and read about the goods that moved from one part of the world to another and how those goods might have had an effect on the people living there. What populations grew? What populations shrank? Thanks so much for watching with us today. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and we'll get back with you same time tomorrow.